Donna handed over the keys to her $1.2 million estate, the Ferrari, and her CEO title without shedding a single tear. Her husband, Mark, thought he had just won the most one-sided divorce settlement in state history. The house, the cars, the company, everything was now his. He walked out of the courtroom smiling, convinced he had taken everything from her. But there was one document he never bothered to read. And by the time the judge finished reviewing it, Mark wasn't smiling anymore. He was standing there in complete shock, realizing he had just signed the biggest mistake of his life. But to truly understand what unfolded, we should hear it from Donna.
Hello, my name is Donna, and for 15 years, I was the ghost in the machine of Mark Sterling's life. If you saw us at a charity gala or a logistics convention, you saw the great Mark Sterling, the self-made titan in the tailored navy suit, the man who could charm a room into a standing ovation. What you didn't see was me, standing 2 steps behind him, checking my phone for real-time fuel tax updates and shipment delays. I met Mark in a windowless break room of a third-party logistics firm back in 2009. He was 24, drowning in $80,000 of student debt, and wearing a suit that was 2 sizes too big. He had a smile that could sell ice to an Arctic explorer, but he couldn't read a profit and loss statement to save his life. I was the forensic accountant who fixed his errors. I saw a man with potential. He saw a woman with a brain he could use. When we decided to start Sterling Logistics, we didn't start with a venture capital injection. We started with the $150,000 my grandmother Evelyn had left me, money she'd saved from 40 years of teaching elementary school. Mark promised it was a loan, but we never wrote it down. "What's mine is yours, Donna," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I signed the check for our first 3 Freightliners. For the first 5 years, our office was a card table in our garage. I handled the books, the routing, the DOT compliance, and the HR. I worked 18-hour days. I remember sitting at that card table, 9 months pregnant with our daughter Maya, with my swollen ankles resting on a crate of motor oil, while Mark was at a networking golf tournament that cost us $2,000 in entry fees. The day I gave birth to Maya was a Tuesday. By Saturday, I was back at that card table with a newborn strapped to my chest. Why? Because Mark called me from a client lunch saying he couldn't figure out how to run the new payroll software, and the drivers were threatening to strike if they weren't paid by Monday. I sat there, nursing a baby and bleeding from a C-section, while I processed 65 direct deposits. Mark didn't bring me flowers when he got home. He brought me a stack of receipts he needed me to itemize for the tax deduction. As the company grew into a $20 million a year empire, the gap between our lives widened. Mark insisted he needed a $120,000 Mercedes S-Class for client optics. He needed the $5,000 watches. He needed the $1.2 million estate in the suburbs with the heated infinity pool. Meanwhile, I drove a 10-year-old SUV with a permanent Cheerios and juice box stain in the back seat. "You're the CFO, Donna," he'd tell me whenever I mentioned getting something for myself. "You know the margins. We need to keep the overhead low. Besides, you're so naturally beautiful, you don't need the flash." I believed him. I thought my sacrifice was the mortar holding our family's bricks together. I even spent 3 years of my life acting as a full-time nurse for his mother, Beverly. When her hip replacement went south, Mark said he couldn't stomach seeing her in a state-funded facility. So I paid $8,000 a month out of my personal savings, money I'd earned from private consulting on the side, to keep her in a high-end private suite. I was the one who changed her bandages. I was the one who held her hand when she was confused. Mark would visit for 20 minutes on Sundays, post a "blessed to have my mom" selfie on Instagram, and leave before the nurse could ask him to sign a consent form. I was the giver. He was the taker. And for 15 years, I thought that was just the rhythm of a successful marriage. I didn't realize that while I was building a pedestal for him to stand on, he was busy sharpening the axe to cut me down. I had no idea that the man I'd pulled out of debt was preparing to send me into a financial grave. They say that as a forensic accountant, I should have seen it coming. People ask me all the time, "Donna, you track money for a living. How did you miss the hole in your own pocket?" The truth is, when you love someone, you don't audit them. You don't look at your husband of 15 years as a suspect. You look at him as your partner. But that changed on a rainy Tuesday in October, the kind of day where the sky is the color of a wet sidewalk. I was doing a routine internal sweep of Sterling Logistics accounts. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon of reconciling vendor payments before Maya's soccer practice. But as I pulled the quarterly ledger, my stomach did a slow, sickening roll. There was a wire transfer I didn't recognize, then another, and another. The recipient was an entity called Azure Skies LLC. Between June and September, exactly $2.2 million had been drained from our corporate operating account and moved into this shell company. The description for every single transfer? Consulting fees. My hands started to shake. $2.2 million isn't a clerical error. It's a heist. My first thought, and God, I feel so stupid now, was that we were being hacked. I thought some sophisticated group had breached our servers, and Mark was too embarrassed to tell me. I spent 4 hours digging, my eyes burning from the blue light of the monitor. I traced the LLC's registration through 3 different states until I finally hit the brick wall of a registered agent in Delaware. But then I found the mistake. Mark was always sloppy with the small stuff. He had used his personal cell phone number as the secondary contact on the Azure Skies bank application. The air left my lungs. My husband wasn't being robbed. He was the one doing the robbing. He was stealing from our company, the company I built, the company that held our daughter's future, to fund a secret life. I spent the next 48 hours in a trance. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream. I played the tired wife role, making him dinner and nodding as he complained about a difficult client who was stressing him out. Meanwhile, every time he went to the bathroom or took a shower, I was on his laptop, bypassing passwords I'd known for years. I found the emails. They weren't just business-related. There were photos. Photos of a penthouse in downtown Chicago, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows and marble floors that cost more than our first house. And then I found the consultant. It wasn't a veteran logistics expert. It wasn't a high-powered attorney. It was Chloe, my sister, my baby sister, who I had practically raised after our parents died. The girl whose $200,000 medical school tuition I had paid in full so she wouldn't have to start her life in debt like Mark did. I had bought her a car for graduation. I had let her stay in our guest house for months when she needed to find herself. The emails between them were vile. They weren't just about the money. They were about me. Mark told her I was dead weight. He called me the accountant who forgot how to be a woman. He told Chloe that as soon as the Azure Skies account hit $3 million, he was going to file for divorce, claim the business was failing due to my poor management, and leave me with the $1.5 million in back taxes he'd been purposefully accruing by misfiling our corporate returns. Chloe's replies were even worse. She joked about how clueless I was, how I was too busy playing nurse to Beverly to notice that her and Mark were spending weekends at 5-star resorts on my dime. She even suggested that they should try to get full custody of Maya, not because they wanted her, but because it would lower the child support payments. I sat in my 10-year-old SUV in the dark of our garage, the steering wheel cold under my hands, and I listened to the sound of my own heart breaking. It was a hollow, echoing sound. I had given everything, my inheritance, my health, my youth, my career, to a man who was now conspiring with my own blood to leave me in the gutter. They wanted a divorce? They wanted the business? Fine. I would give them exactly what they wanted. But I knew something Mark didn't. When you build a house of cards, you have to make sure the person who designed the foundation isn't the one holding the leaf blower. I wiped my face, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and saw a woman I didn't recognize. The devoted wife was gone. In her place was the forensic accountant who knew exactly where every body was buried in the Sterling Logistics books, and I was about to start digging them up. I didn't want to believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. I needed the visual, the final nail in the coffin of my marriage. The next morning, I told Mark I was heading to a warehouse audit in Indiana. Instead, I drove 3 hours straight to the Gold Coast of Chicago, to the address I'd pulled from the Azure Skies registration papers. The building was a glass needle piercing the clouds. The lobby smelled like expensive lilies and old money, the kind of place where the doorman looks at your 10-year-old SUV like it's a pile of trash. I waited. I sat in my car at a meter across the street, gripping a cold cup of coffee, feeling like a stranger in my own life. At 11:45 a.m., they walked out. Mark looked younger than I'd seen him in years. He was wearing a new, slate-gray Italian suit and laughing, a genuine, deep-belly laugh I hadn't heard at home in a decade. And there was Chloe, my sister. She was draped in a trench coat that probably cost more than my first car, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. They looked like a power couple. They looked like they belonged. They stopped at the curb, and Mark pulled her in close, kissing her right there in the daylight, completely indifferent to the world. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with the same tenderness he used to show me when we were 24 and broke. I felt a physical surge of nausea. I wanted to floor the accelerator. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. But as I watched them climb into a waiting black car, something inside me went cold. It wasn't just cold. It was absolute zero. The heat of the betrayal had burnt away all the Donna that was soft and forgiving. I didn't follow them. Instead, I used my master key to enter the Sterling Logistics satellite office nearby. I sat in a dark cubicle and pulled up the real-time GPS tracking for our fleet. I watched the little blue dots representing our trucks moving across the country, trucks bought with my grandmother's money. I looked at the payroll logs. I looked at the consulting ledger. "You want the empire, Mark?" I whispered to the empty room. "Then you're going to get every single piece of it, including the parts that are currently on fire." I spent the rest of the day gathering gifts. I downloaded the private server logs that proved Mark had been using company funds to pay the $12,000 a month rent on that penthouse. I found the receipts for the jewelry he'd bought Chloe, labeled in our system as office supplies. I even found the wire transfers he'd sent to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, thinking he was being clever by using a VPN. He didn't know that I had installed the keystroke logger on his laptop 3 years ago when I thought we were being targeted by corporate espionage. I had his passwords, his deleted drafts, and his secret bank codes. When I got home that night, Mark was sitting on the sofa, nursing a scotch. "Long day at the warehouse, honey?" he asked, not even looking up from his iPad. "Very long," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "I think it's time we talk about the future of the company, Mark. I'm tired. I think I'm ready to step back and let you take full control." The way his eyes lit up, that predatory, greedy sparkle, told me everything I needed to know. He thought the dumb, tired wife was finally giving up. He didn't realize I was just handing him a live grenade with the pin already pulled. For the next 3 weeks, I gave the performance of a lifetime. If there were an Oscar for wife on the verge of a nervous breakdown, I would have swept the category. I stopped wearing makeup. I wore my oldest, most oversized sweaters. I let the house get a little cluttered. I wanted Mark to see a woman who was defeated, a woman who had finally been broken by the weight of the life he'd forced upon her. "I just can't do the numbers anymore, Mark," I told him one evening, my voice trembling perfectly as I pushed a plate of overcooked pasta toward him. "The stress, the audits, the constant pressure. I think you were right. I've become dead weight." I watched him share a quick, triumphant glance with his phone, likely a text to Chloe. "It's okay, Donna," he said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily sympathy. "You've worked so hard. Maybe it's time you just focused on being a mom. I can take over the CEO title. I'll handle the assets. We can even settle the divorce quietly, without all those expensive lawyers getting in the way. I'll take care of you." "You'd do that?" I sniffled, dabbing at my dry eyes with a tissue. "You'd take the burden of the company off my hands?" "Of course," he smirked. "I'll take the house, the cars, and Sterling Logistics. You can have a small cash settlement, and we'll call it even. No alimony, no messy court battles, just a clean break." He thought he was being a genius. In his mind, he was tricking me into giving up a $20 million company for pennies. But while I was playing the victim at the dinner table, I was a ghost in the office at 3 a.m. I began the cleanup, but not the kind he expected. First, I addressed the environmental and regulatory liability. One of our main warehouse sites in East Chicago sat on land that had been a chemical processing plant in the 40s. I had spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on mitigation and soil testing to keep us compliant. I quietly let those permits expire. I misplaced the remediation reports. Then I filed a formal Notice of Potential Contamination with the EPA as an anonymous whistleblower, citing recent observations of soil discoloration. Next, I focused on the personal guarantee. Most of our corporate debt was tied to the company, but for Mark to take 100% ownership and remove my name, the bank required a new master security agreement. I drafted the document myself. Mark didn't even read it. He was too busy looking at brochures for yachts. I inserted a clause that made the individual owner personally liable for all corporate debts, tax liens, and undisclosed regulatory fines, bypassing the usual corporate veil protection. But the masterstroke was the Azure Skies trap. Mark had been funneling that $2.2 million into the LLC to hide it from the divorce court. He thought that money was his getaway fund. I realized that if I flagged the money as stolen now, he'd just move it. Instead, I backdated a series of intercompany loan agreements. I made it look like Sterling Logistics had loaned Azure Skies $2.2 million at a staggering 15% interest rate, with the loan becoming fully callable upon any change in company leadership. I also made sure to document every penny I had loaned the company from my grandmother's inheritance. I filed a formal UCC-1 financing statement, a legal lien, against the company's equipment. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a secured creditor. On the night before the final mediation, Mark came home smelling like Chloe's perfume and expensive bourbon. He handed me a stack of papers. The final settlement, Donna. I kept the house and the business, just like we talked about. I even threw in an extra $50,000 for you to find a nice little apartment. I looked at the papers. He was taking the $1.2 million house, the Ferrari, the Mercedes, and the entire logistics empire. He was leaving me with a used SUV and a tiny fraction of the wealth I'd built. Are you sure this is fair, Mark? I asked, my voice small. It's more than fair, Donna. It's a fresh start for both of us. I signed the papers. I signed them with a steady hand and a cold heart. He didn't realize that by taking the house, he was taking a property bought with Azure Skies money that was about to be flagged as federal wire fraud. By taking the business, he was taking an $8 million environmental nightmare. He thought he was winning the lottery. He didn't realize he was just signing a confession. The morning of the final hearing was bright and deceptively calm. I dressed in a charcoal suit that was a little too loose, the shrinking, grieving wife look. Mark, on the other hand, looked like he was heading to a coronation. He wore a crisp white shirt, a silk tie the color of money, and a smug grin that he didn't even try to hide. Chloe was there too, sitting in the back row of the gallery like a supportive friend, wearing a pair of oversized designer sunglasses. We sat at the mahogany table in Judge Miller's courtroom. Mark's lawyer, a shark in a $3,000 suit, laid out the settlement with a flourish. Your Honor, the parties have reached an amicable agreement. Mr. Sterling will retain the primary residence and the commercial assets of Sterling Logistics, while Mrs. Sterling will receive a lump sum payment and the remaining personal vehicles. Judge Miller peered over his glasses at me. Mrs. Sterling, you are waiving alimony, your share of a $20 million company, and your interest in a $1 million property. Are you sure you understand what you are signing? I just want it to be over, Your Honor, I whispered, my voice cracking at just the right frequency. I can't fight anymore. Mark practically lunged for the pen. He signed his name with a jagged, arrogant stroke. Mark Sterling, CEO. He leaned back, crossing his ankles, already looking at his watch. He probably had a victory lunch at Nobu planned with my sister. Now, the judge said, there is the matter of the final disclosure document filed by the petitioner this morning. Mr. Sterling, have you reviewed the notice of regulatory and debt assumption attached to the final decree? Mark's lawyer frowned. Your Honor, my client has signed the transfer of all corporate liabilities as part of the total ownership package. We are aware of the standard debt. This isn't standard, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave. He turned the page. That was the moment the trap snapped shut. I see here, the judge continued, a certified report from the Environmental Protection Agency regarding a Tier 1 violation at the East Chicago facility. Total estimated remediation costs, $6.4 million. I also see a personal guarantee signed by Mr. Sterling, making him, and I quote, solely and personally liable for all federal environmental fines and backdated tax penalties. Mark's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. What? No, that's just a formality. Donna, what is he talking about? I didn't look at him. I looked at the judge. Your Honor, as the former CFO, I felt it was my fiduciary duty to ensure all consulting fees paid to Azure Skies LLC were properly categorized before I stepped down. I've submitted the corrected filings to the IRS. Since Mark is now the 100% owner, he is responsible for the $2 million tax deficiency and the associated fraud penalties. The courtroom went silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Mark's lawyer scrambled for the papers, his face turning a vivid shade of purple. Wait, Mark stammered, his voice rising. The Azure Skies money? That's not... You can't categorize that as taxable income for me. Actually, I said, finally turning to look him in the eye, since you signed the document stating that Azure Skies was a wholly owned subsidiary to hide it from our joint marital assets, the IRS views that money as a dividend you didn't report. And since you are now the sole officer of Sterling Logistics, the EPA fines for the chemical leaks you ignored are now your personal debt. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Two men in dark suits and windbreakers with IRS-CI printed in bold yellow letters walked in. They weren't there for me. Mark Sterling, one of them asked. Mark looked at Chloe. He looked for the woman who was supposed to be his medical consultant and partner in crime. But Chloe wasn't looking at him. She had seen the badges. She was already standing up, backing toward the door, her face pale with the realization that she had hitched her wagon to a sinking ship. She didn't stay to say goodbye. She turned and ran. The final document I filed, Mark, I said, my voice finally regaining its strength, wasn't a surrender. It was a 200-page whistleblower report. Under the law, as the person who reported the fraud, I'm entitled to 30% of whatever the government recovers from you. Mark looked at the judge, then at the agents, then at the empty seat where my sister had been. He looked like a man who had jumped off a cliff thinking he could fly, only to realize he'd forgotten his parachute. The last time I saw Mark, he wasn't the titan of logistics. He was a broken man in a cheap windbreaker, being escorted through a side exit by two federal agents. The Ferrari he loved so much was already being loaded onto a flatbed in our driveway, seized as a proceed of the Azure Skies wire fraud. The $1.2 million house? It was cordoned off within 48 hours, the bank and the IRS fighting over who got the bones of the estate first. Because I had given him everything, I had also given him the total, crushing weight of every lie he'd ever told. By the time the EPA finished with him, Mark was facing $8 million in personal debt. He didn't have a business to save him. I had already called in the $150,000 lien for my grandmother's loan, which, along with my whistleblower fee, allowed me to strip the remaining liquid cash from the company's payroll account legally before the freeze. As for Chloe, she vanished. Once she realized the consulting fees were gone and Mark was heading toward a mandatory minimum sentence for tax evasion, her love evaporated. I heard she tried to move back into the guest house of one of her med school friends, but news travels fast. In our circle, she isn't a doctor. She's the girl who tried to bury her own sister for a penthouse she couldn't keep. I didn't stay to watch the wreckage burn. I took Maya and drove. Now I'm sitting on a weathered wooden porch in a small coastal town in Maine. The air doesn't smell like diesel fumes or expensive lilies. It smells like salt and pine. My daughter is 100 yards away chasing seagulls on a private stretch of beach that Mark will never find. I don't have the Sterling name anymore. I went back to my maiden name the day the divorce was finalized. I'm not a ghost in the machine or a devoted wife. I'm just Donna. I have a modest cottage, my grandmother's $150,000, which I've already doubled through smart, quiet investments, and something Mark will never understand. I have peace. Mark thought he won because he took the assets. He forgot that assets can be seized, companies can be sued, and houses can be foreclosed. But the brain that built the empire? That stays with me. He thought I was the one losing everything. He just didn't realize that everything he won was actually his prison cell. And as I watched the sun dip below the Atlantic horizon, I finally realized I didn't just survive Mark Sterling. I outcalculated him.
What an incredible, chilling journey for Donna. But now I want to hear from you. At what point do you think Mark's greed became his point of no return? And do you think Donna's cold calculation was justified, or did she go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. It is important to remember that the story you just witnessed was a fictional dramatization created specifically for societal reform and educational awareness. We share these intense scenarios to pull back the curtain on dark realities like financial abuse and betrayal so that you can recognize the red flags and protect yourselves. Please do not attempt to repeat the schemes or negative behaviors shown here in your own lives. We show you these mistakes so you don't have to make them. In the end, Donna's story proves that while you can steal a person's work, you can never steal their worth. If you learned something valuable from this video, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us daily.